You owe me nothing. Not coin, not work, not company.
That paper you tore, does it change anything?
He bought the most beautiful Apache slave woman, and by dawn, she carried his name. Jeremiah Stone's auction yard sat behind the mercantile, where the dirt was tramped flat, and the boards of a low platform showed nail heads that had risen with weather. Men crowded the rails, and their breath smoked in the cold, and the sound was coins, boots, a voice that carried because it trained itself to carry. The sheriff stood under the porch eave with his hat low and his attention spread wide. And the woman on the platform kept her back straight with a torn buckskin dress hanging open at the neckline and at the hip where the fringe had pulled through a splinter. Her braid was tight with a leather tie, and one small feather lay against her shoulder. She did not wipe the dust from her face, and she did not look down at her feet because the crowd already tried to push her head there with their eyes. Jeremiah Stone came to town for salt, nails, and fence wire, and a tin of axle grease. He had a list folded in his pocket and coins set aside for winter feed. He meant to speak to Sheriff Silas about riders seen near the creek line after dark and then ride home with daylight to spare. That was the plan when he tied his horse to the hitch and felt the wind run down the street. The plan bent when he heard the auction voice and saw the platform and the woman standing still under too many stairs. His stomach went tight because the scene matched old things that never left him. He felt his leg pull where a bullet crease still woke in cold weather, and the scar across his knuckles itched under the glove seam. He breathed out slow and counted nails and salt and wire in his head to hold steady. He watched the woman measure the crowd with quick, flat looks that wasted nothing, and he understood the look because he had used it when he was young, and the world seemed ready to take his name along with everything else. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Ilara had been brought to Cinder Creek at dawn, after a hard ride bound to a mule's lead. She had been taken the day before on the far side of the creek, where the cottonwoods thinned, and a pair of ranch hands moved in close and spoke soft to slow her feet. A third man came from behind, and she did not see him until his weight was on her shoulders. They tied her wrists and cut the side of her dress when a rope caught, and they laughed because it was easy to laugh when nobody stopped them. On the road, she watched the sky and the edges of things for a chance to step away without getting dragged. By the time they reached town, her wrists were raw, and she told herself to keep her spine straight because it was the only part they could not force. Her thoughts were clean and numbered, and she kept a short line. Stay standing, keep breathing, even read faces, watch hands, pick one person who might move differently, and set everything on that if it comes. Jeremiah stood with his hands down and his jaw tight, and tried to decide what was his business and what was not. He knew the sheriff had shut down gambling rooms and broken up 2 fistfights last week, and could not shut this down without a riot. He knew the parson hated the yard, but kept to his small house with his wife and his ledger because there was only so much a man could push in one winter. He felt the old weight of choosing come on him. He told himself to buy his wire and keep quiet and leave other people to answer for themselves. He lasted 1 minute under the auctioneer's chant, and the numbers and the jokes, and the way the men leaned forward with their mouths half open like they were picking a mule. He looked once at the woman and saw her refusing to round her shoulders to make it easier on the crowd. He decided that if there was a clean way to end one thing today, then that would be his job. Not because it solved the county, and not because it made him better than anyone, only because he had the coin in the back to carry the result home. The auctioneer called a number and smiled to make it sting less, and a hand at the rail went up, and the yard made a rough sound. Jeremiah raised his hand once, and put a number that was too high for play and just low enough to be possible. He kept his face flat. The yard quieted because nobody liked to bleed their own pockets for a morning's entertainment. The second hand at the rail slid down. The auctioneer's patter stumbled and then found its step and ran its short course. The bid stood alone and the hammer fell in a practice clap, and the clerk hustled out with a pencil bill of sale that smelled like damp ink. Jeremiah took the paper, and it was warm from the clerk's hand, and he saw the place where the woman's name should be, and it was left blank because they had not asked it. His throat closed on the heat of that, and he tore the paper in half without lifting his eyes, and let both pieces fall where the dust could take them. He said, "You're coming with me." And he spoke quiet enough that it landed only on the people who needed to hear it. He did not reach for the woman's arm, and he did not hold up the torn paper, only turned enough to let her see the road out, and then looked once at the sheriff. Sheriff Silas pushed off the post and stepped closer with a face that gave nothing away and said, "Keep it peaceable," which was a warning that was also permission. Two men at the rail shifted like they had energy left for trouble, and the sheriff laid his hand on the butt of his holstered gun and rolled his shoulder. And the energy drained the way it should when a man is ready to work all the way through a job. Ilara watched the one who had bid and saw the gray at his temples and the heel break across his nose, and the way he stood like a man who had carried a body once and learned how to keep going. She checked his boots, his gloves, the set of his shoulders. She saw no rope in his hand and no fast smile. She looked for the little movements that give a person away, eyes dragging down the front of her dress, fingers tapping, jaw clenched with hunger, and she did not find them. She felt fear sit hard under her ribs, but it was the steady kind that keeps a person awake. She did not owe anyone a show of gratitude. She owed herself a clear head and a plan. The plan changed now because a door opened and she could step through it and keep her name. She came down the steps without taking the hand that a boy reached out to make himself feel generous. She kept her chin level. She did not run because running makes a chase, and she was done drawing races for men who had nothing else to do. Jeremiah walked beside her through the split in the crowd that opened too slow for his liking. A ranch hand from the far creek said a word meant to stick, and Jeremiah looked at him once and the word fell off. His pulse was loud in his ears, and his leg ached, and he told himself to keep the next minute simple. Get to the horses. Put one foot in the stirrup. Put her on the spare mare with her wrist free. Do not speak more than needed because talk gives men room to step in. If someone reached for her, he would break the wrist and hand it back and deal with the charge later. He did not want to fight, and he was ready for one. They reached the hitch. Jeremiah untied his horse and the spare and kept his back turned broad to the yard so nobody could work a hand past him. He felt her pause, and he did not crowd her. She tested the knot at her own wrist and found it gone because one of the hands had cut it when the bidding ended to show the yard there was no meanness in it. The lie of that made Jeremiah's teeth grind once, and he let it go because anger would slow them. Ilara put a hand to the saddle and drew a breath through her nose and set her weight to mount with a swing that showed she had ridden before. Jeremiah lifted the rein into her hand and passed up a canteen and a folded coat he kept tied to the rig. "For the road," he said, and it came out flat and steady. She pulled the coat around her shoulders with one quick motion and did not thank him, and he did not expect it. They moved out under the open sky with the mercantile shrinking behind them and the yard noise losing its shape. Jeremiah felt the tightness in his chest shift to the work ahead. 12 miles, a stone well, a bed to offer, with a door that opened from the inside. He started the count in his head of fences that would need mending in the spring and supplies he would have to delay, and he accepted the trade because he had made it himself. Ilara looked over the street and the side lanes and the roofs for any sign that the men who brought her here would follow, and she noted the sheriff's position at the end of the boardwalk, and the way his face turned to the two hands who had done most of the pushing. She filed it and let her shoulders loosen one notch. Her mission for the day set itself in plain terms. Leave his place on her feet. Keep her name. Keep her choices. Learn the lines of the man who said, "Come with me," and decide what to do with his offer. Once there was a door she could close, they did not speak again until town was behind them, and the creek line showed clean and silver under the pale sun. The decision had been made in the yard, and now they would live with it on the road. The wind cut across the flats, and both of them lowered their hats into it and let their horses settle into a pace that could be held. Behind them, the yard returned to other business, and in front of them, the track set its quiet line toward a ranch that had room for a second plate if a person decided to stay. Nothing about it was grand, and nothing about it was simple. Both of them knew that, and kept riding. They rode out of Cinder Creek with the noise of the yard flattening behind them and the mercantile shrinking to a square. the creek cutting its pale line off to the right, and the road to the ranch running straight until it rose and fell over low ground. I kept my gelding a half-length ahead so I could set the pace and watch for dust at our back while still giving her room. She settled on the spare mare with a rider's balance that told me she had done this before. Her hands held low, too, to spare the raw skin at the wrists. The wool coat I had handed up lay tight over her shoulders, with the collar turned up against the wind. Neither of us spoke for the first mile because the first mile is for listening, for counting how many hoofbeats belong to you and how many to strangers, for letting the heart stop pounding hard enough to think. I measured what could still go wrong and ticked through it in order, because order kept fear from spreading. There could be riders from the yard who wanted to turn a sale into a grudge. There could be a deputy with more order than good sense. There could be one of the hands who took offense at how fast the sheriff's stare shut him down and now wanted to prove something out on the flats where there were no eyes. I ran a finger down the Henry's side plate where it rode in the scabbard and checked the weight of the Colt at my hip and told myself not to use either unless someone put a hand on her and kept it there. I felt the old crease in my thigh, pulling in the cold, and understood that if it came to a run, I would have to decide in one breath whether to stand or throw my body in the way, and trust my horse to hold. I had spent last spring selling off 2 dwindled heifers and a wagon I no longer needed, so I could buy fence wire and seed and keep a little coin aside for breaks and storms. I had not saved it to spend on this, I had not planned for this, and yet, down in my chest where decisions settle, it already felt like money put where it belonged. Ilera watched the line of our shadow move over scrub and stone, and used the steady rhythm to separate what mattered now from what could wait. The skin under the rope burned stung with each flex of her fingers, and she kept the rein easy to keep the sting from shaping her mood. The coat smelled faintly of smoke and horse, and a clean scent like sun off old cotton, and the weight of it hid the torn places in her dress until she could make them hers again. She checked the horizon for dust, and the edges of mesquite for a shine of metal, and once, without turning her head, she looked back and saw Sheriff Silas still on the boardwalk with his shoulder against a post, and his gaze following the 2 hands who had moved the fastest in the yard. That told her the first bend in the road was safer than it might have been. The second bend would be theirs alone. She told herself to keep her back straight, because folding invites pushing, and she had done enough of other people's work today. We took the low draw that crossed the road where the creek ran narrow, the water slow and clear under a skin of thin ice that cracked softly as it touched the edges. I eased the horses down to drink and stepped off to the gravel bar and crouched without asking. "Let me see," I said, and I kept my palms open at my sides so she could decide. She slid down, careful, boots finding the rock by habit. Her face gave nothing away. She held out her wrists only after she judged the space and the angle of my body, and the distance to the guns and the horses. I did not reach fast. I hooked a thumb under the cuff of my glove and pulled it free with my teeth, and the cold bit my skin and steadied my head. I unbuttoned the small tin of salve from my pocket. "Winter hands," I said, because names for simple things could make harder things easier to stand. I worked the salve along the rope lines without pressing, and kept my eyes on the skin and the ointment and the white edges where the blood would come if a person was careless. She watched my hands and then washed my face and found a plain attention there, and not a single flinch toward her chest or the torn dress. She took the tin when I offered it and pushed it into the coat pocket like a promise she controlled. We ate where we stood. 2 strips of jerky, a heel of yesterday's bread I had stuffed into my saddlebag before riding into town, a swallow of canteen water that tasted of tin and cold, and the food put blood back where it belonged and quit the shaking in her legs that fear sometimes leaves behind. I pointed with my chin up the road. 12 miles yet, I said. Stonewell halfway if the wind hasn't dropped a branch across it. And she nodded once because numbers she could measure sat better than reassurances that had no weight. I added, "If we're followed, we'll see their dust by the second rise." And I saw the muscle along her jaw ease because I had said the thing out loud instead of pretending it wasn't there. We mounted up and the road opened and the sky smoothed to a pale, hard blue with a southeast wind that cut through coats. The spare mare tested the bit once and then settled, and Alara moved with her without thinking. We covered another mile before a single rider came in from behind at a lope that wanted to be noticed. I felt my neck go warm and turned my head just enough to set the angle of my eyes. The rider was a ranch hand from the far creek with a new hat he hadn't earned and a smile that showed teeth when there was no joke. He reined in just far enough off to stay in the space where a person can claim he isn't crowding. "You paid high," the man said, letting his look slide where it had already tried to slide in the yard. "Could have had cheaper if you waited till afternoon." I didn't answer. I kept my horse between the man and Alara and set the gelding's shoulder, so it would be work for the other to move closer without making it plain. The hand's grin thinned when he noticed the Henry's stock and the way my right boot hung easy and ready, and the quiet that meant no talk was coming. "Sheriff says it's over," I said finally, not as a threat and not as an invitation, just a fact placed where it needed to be placed. The rider clicked his tongue and turned his horse with a little show of dust that didn't amount to much. "Ain't over in the cards," he said with a safe face, and trotted back toward town because the courage that plays in crowds seldom rides alone. Alara let out a breath she had been holding since the first drum of that horse reached us, and she did it quietly so it wouldn't sound like thanks and wouldn't sound like fear leaving. She said, "If the sheriff hadn't been there." And I shook my head once. "He was," I said. "That's the measure." She considered that and filed it under things to test later, because men say clean words on clean days, and then weather comes, and the same words turn. She decided to ask what she needed to ask on the road where the answers couldn't corner her. "Do you have other hands out there?" she said, and I kept my eyes forward when I answered. "Not this winter. Sold 2 head to pay out wages before the freeze. It's just me and a dog that thinks too much of himself." And that put a picture in her mind. She could weigh a house with 1 man in it, and a dog that barked when strangers came, and maybe a chair with a loose rung, and a stove that needed its flue brushed. She asked the next thing because it was the one that would come up at the door. Where would I sleep? And I didn't pause. Spare room on the north wall, window that sticks in cold, door latches from inside. And she heard the last part and felt something in her shoulders drop down a notch because that was a detail a liar never adds. I followed with the thing she had not asked because I understood what the yard had done and what the road still could do. "You owe me nothing," I said. "Not coin, not work, not company. You eat and you warm up and you sleep with the door how you want it. And in the morning, if you want the stage road, I'll take you there. Or if you want the parson, we can answer his questions. Or if you want a day to think, we'll set that day where it fits." I did not look over to see if any of that landed because looking can turn an offer into a pressure. I gave it and kept my hands where she could see them on the horn and the rein. The questions most people would have asked first had to wait until she believed the small ones, but she tried one more because it dug at a practical edge. "That paper you tore," she said. "Does it change anything?" And I nodded once. Clerk saw the coin. Sheriff saw the coin. The paper only made a show for men who like shows. Nobody owns you and nobody can pretend if they try. Tearing it says, "No one walks around with a claim in his pocket. If they come to argue, we'll argue at a desk with witnesses and not in a yard." That answer did not make the skin at the back of her neck prickle the way fancy talk does. It laid out steps and rooms and people with names, and it made a path she could walk if she had to. She tested the words against the yard, and found they fit better than anything else she'd been handed lately. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second, and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from, so I don't feel so alone out here. We reached the stone well before the halfway rise, and the wind dropped as if the land had set its hand over the mouth of a bottle. I drew both horses to a stop and worked the bucket up with a rope that burned my palm and would have to be replaced before spring. We watered the animals and let them breathe. I used the quiet to speak a brief background because secrets breed suspicion when they're not meant to. My brother died in '66 on a stretch of ground not worth the bullets. I came here after and put up fence where the willows could hold. I don't gamble and I don't drink except coffee too long on the boil. I don't keep company because I don't have spare words for it, and because I wasn't ready to hear anyone else's sleep. I thought a second longer and added, I go to town for supplies and to pay taxes and a nod at people who mean well, and then I go home. I didn't offer a smile and I didn't dress any of it. I let it sit. Elara matched me with what she chose and no more. I learned to ride on a pony that tried to scrape me off on every post we own. I can sew a straight seam and skin a rabbit, and I don't sing unless it's for keeping time. My camp is not a place I can return to. I won't give you the names of the men in the yard because they don't get carried in my mouth. She checked my face to see if I would press for more, and I did not. So she took one more thing out and said it between us. If I stay tonight, it is because I say so. And if I leave tomorrow, it is because I say so. I said, that's the only way it works. And the well gave us back only the sound of water and rope and breath. We rode the last miles with the land open and the wind leaning less. The sun climbed a hand's width and then hung there, and the flats showed Pronghorn far off, and the sky stayed clear, no dust behind us, no metal flash off to the side, just our two sets of tracks, and the day stripped down to horses and air and the next gate. I pointed with my chin when the ranch finally showed, the roofline low and dark, the corral with the sag in the middle rail I had been meaning to fix, the cottonwoods along the frozen ribbon of water with thin shoots already showing at the bases where the ground kept its secrets warm. Stone well there, I said. Barn leans a little because the posts settled wrong 20 years ago when a man in a hurry sunk them shallow. House is sound, stove pulls strong. Dog will bark, and then remember he has met me before. And as if on cue, a raw-boned dog loped out from behind the corner with his tail up and his voice loud, and then when he heard my voice, dropped it down to a working level and trotted 3 circles because pride is hard to put away. At the gate, I swung down and worked the chain without making her wait in the cold wind. I held it wide for her, and she rode through, and the mare's ears flicked toward the barn, and then toward the house, and then settled. I closed the gate careful and set the chain back so it would not slap in the night. I did not reach for a rein or her hand. I only said, water first, then heat, and led the way to the well, where the bucket travel was smooth and sure, and the rope barely complained. The dog sniffed at Alara's boot and then at the hem of the coat and then backed off a step out of the huff because he had decided to be polite. She stepped down without help and landed easy. Her eyes took in the porch, the window, the door, the way the hinges were set flush and strong, the path a person could take if she wanted to leave in the dark without stumbling into the woodpile. The questions a listener would hold from the first chapter: whether anyone would follow, whether the law would twist, whether the man had the money or the temper to make a choice and stand with it, whether the woman was walking into another trap, whether there was anyone else inside the house, whether she would be allowed to choose the next step, had answers now said in plain pieces. A sheriff who looked and stayed until the bend, a torn paper with the clerk and the coin behind it, a man who had saved a little and spent it and did not ask credit for it, a road ridden without hands, put where they didn't belong, a house with no other man, a door latch that turned from the inside, and a set of options spoken out loud before the threshold, so the threshold would not hold a lie. I lifted the saddle from the spare mare's back and set it on the rail and rubbed the damp hair with a burlap scrap, and the motion put warmth back into my hands and quiet into my head. I set my hat on a peg by the door and stepped aside so she could go in first if she wanted, or stand outside a minute longer if that sat better. The smell of cooled bread and old coffee came through the cracked door, and the stove metal ticked faint under the draft. She looked once at the open road, as if to confirm it would still be there in an hour. Then she crossed the threshold on her own decision, and the dog slipped in behind her with a final short bark that sounded like a house, remembering the sound of people. I closed the door with the same care I had used for the gate and left the latch in her hand to set, and the next work of the day waited inside, where the light from the small window boxed itself on the table, and the air already felt a little softer than the yard we had left behind. The door shut behind us with a plain wood sound, and I left the latch resting in her palm, so she could feel the weight and the turn and decide how it moved. The room held the steady heat of an iron stove, with a draft pulled halfway. A loaf sat under a cloth on the table. A pot hung from the swing arm with beans, giving off the slow smell of salt pork. A tin cup cooled near the edge. The dog circled once and lay down where he could watch both the door and the stove without having to choose. Her eyes went over everything because a first look fixes the line of a place. The window that caught clean light, the hooks for coats, a low shelf with 3 plates and 2 blue cups, a rack over the door with a Henry rifle laid empty and open, and the cylinder of a Colt in my holster that stayed on my belt and not on a chair where a person might wake to it. I hung my hat on a peg and stepped 1 pace off so she was not cornered by table or wall. "No one else here," I said. "Won't be. Not tonight. Not any night, unless I say before they come." I pointed with my chin to the room straight across the small hall. "There's your bed if you want it. North wall, window sticks in cold but it lifts. Latch turns from inside. There is no key because I don't keep keys. If you want a bar, I can set a board." I did not move toward the door to show it. I stood still and let the words do the showing. She answered nothing yet. She set the latch down on the table to mark that she had learned it. Then she moved to the spare room and stood in the doorway and looked hard. The bed was narrow and clean. The quilt faded where a sunstrip had sat for years. A small trunk with a split hinge sat open with nothing inside but a folded blanket. The window had frost in the corners and a nail pushed into the sash to keep it from rattling. She lifted the sash a finger's width and set it down again to test the truth of the stick. It stuck, and then came free when she set her shoulder to it. She nodded once to herself and went back to the kitchen. I set a folded white shirt on the chair back, and a length of clean cotton-like bandage rolled tight. "This will fit well enough until we can fix your dress," I said. And I turned my face to the stove and checked the draft so she could change without watching my back for turns. She did not hurry the buttons because rushing makes hands clumsy. She kept the wool coat on the chair ready if the door opened. She pulled the shirt on, and the cotton sat smooth over her shoulders and hid the torn places. She worked the bandage around the wrist, where a rope had chewed the skin, and asked with her eyes if a knot would hold one-handed. I said, "Tie to the inside so it won't snag," and kept my hands down and away until she stepped back. Her stomach turned once, and then steadied when the bread came out on the cloth. And I cut 2 thick pieces with a knife that had been sharp and square for work and not for show. I set a plate in front of her and poured beans from the pot. Steam rose and hit the air, and the smell reached all the way to the back of her head and told her body to ease. She ate with her eyes on the door and the window, and then on my hands as they moved. I ate slower, watching the stove and the dog and the small things men forget when they're used to eating alone. When she finished the first plate, I filled it again without comment, because second plates should not be a test. She drank water and then coffee, and almost asked me to boil it less, and then left it because she had other questions first. "What now?" she said. And she kept her voice level so it would not carry worry or promise to a place it did not belong. "You tell me what you want," I said, and I meant it in the way I set my fork down and gave her all of my face and none of my weight. "I can take you to the stage road at first light, or to the parson if you want papers and a shield between you and talk. Or you stay in that room with the door how you like it and think 1 day or 3. Work if you want to work because work helps a day go by. Sit if you want to sit. Eat either way." I looked once at her bandaged wrists. "You own nothing here." And I left it there. She tested the ground the same way she had tested the window, 1 inch, then another. "If men come," she said, "the ones from the yard or the ones who brought me?" I said, "They will meet me first. If they want the law, we walk to the desk with the clerk and the sheriff. If they want trouble, they find none. The paper they had is gone, and the sheriff saw me tear it. If there's a claim, it has to be spoken in daylight with names on it. And then we answer with names." I pointed at the rifle rack. "Gun stays there unless a person reaches for you." I tapped the Colt with 2 fingers. "This stays on me, but it stays quiet." The dog thumped its tail once as if agreeing to order. She set down the cup and let a beat pass, then put a small thing on the table that mattered as much as the larger ones. "My name is Ilara," she said. I didn't say it in the yard because they would use it. I said, "Jeremiah Stone." and the sound of the names made the room different in the way a person decides to stand in it. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." The missing pieces that a listener might have wanted from the first telling began to set themselves in place without stopping the day. Who else lived here? No one. Where the guns sat, one visible, empty, the other holstered and quiet. Whether he kept keys, he did not. Whether she could wash and tend the rope burns, a basin and kettle sat by the stove. I poured hot water and set it with a sliver of soap and turned away while she cleaned and wrapped. Whether there was a plan beyond food and breath, there were 3 choices laid out, each with steps and names. Whether he expected labor and trade, I had set a plain no debt. Whether he would push for a bed, not hers, I had said nothing of beds, and had pointed to a door she could bar. I lifted the kettle with a rag and poured into a tin basin, set it on the table, and slid a cake of soap beside it, and then stepped back to the stove to check the damper again, even though it did not need checking. She washed the rope burns and the dust from her face, and the cut at the hip where the dress had torn. She did it with steady hands, and the bandage held. "There's a comb in the trunk," I said, toward the hall, "because a person who lives alone forgets where little things end up." She went and found it and set her hair right braid tight, leather ties smooth, feather laid where she had kept it since morning. I opened the small trunk and showed what was there so she would not need to look when she was alone. Blanket, comb, 2 lengths of cotton for mending, a tin of buttons, a needle book with 3 sizes. "No dress that fits," I said. "We'll trade for proper things when you choose what you want to wear." She touched the needle book because a person who can sew can take control of the day. "I can fix the tear," she said. "Not now," I said. "Eat first, warm first, choose first." And the order calmed the tight places in her ribs more than any soft talk could. When the food was done, I rinsed the plates, and she watched how I worked. No wasted motion. Water poured into a pan, a rag used and wrung. Plates set to dry on their sides, knife wiped and hung on the same nail. The routine told her who I was without a story. I asked, "Any food that makes you sick? Because men think of this too late." She shook her head, then paused and said, "I can't take whiskey." I nodded. "There is none here." And the dog thumped again as if to stamp the fact. I brought out a ledger I kept for feed and nails and taxes and set it on the table and turned to a blank page so the old numbers didn't press on the day. "If you want the parson, I will write what we need to say so we don't forget when men who make a living with paper try to sound bigger than us." I said it without heat, only a fact. She looked at the page and saw a space where her name could sit without being bent. Then she closed the book with her palm and left it unopened, so the choice could wait until morning without living in ink before it was ready. She stood and walked the small loop of the house to learn it. Front door, stove, table, peg, hall. My room at the end with the door open so she could see a bed and a chair and a pair of boots, set heel to heel and nothing else. No bottles, no stack of crates, no hidden corners. Back to the spare room, the window again, the view out to the cottonwoods and the frozen run of water, and the corral with the sag rail she had noticed from the roadwork she could see in a name. "That rail needs a brace," she said from the doorway, as if speaking to the house. I nodded. "Tomorrow," I said. "If the cold holds, we can sink a post, and the set will last." I said, "we," and then let the words settle without checking her face for how it landed. She went back to the kitchen and took the salve from the coat pocket and set it on the shelf where she could reach it without asking. The dog shifted to make space for her feet, as if he had lived with her for years. She did not touch his head, and he did not ask for it. She sat and felt the heat from the stove come through the chair seat to the back of her legs, and a sensation grounded her in a way that did not need words. I said, "I will be in the shed a short time to split kindling. The axe is sharp. You will hear 2 strikes, and then a pause, and then 2 more. I said it to put a rhythm to the minutes so she could map them. If a stranger comes to the yard, I will call your name once, and then stand in the doorway, so you can see me see him." I added the detail because it mattered. She listened to the 2 strikes and the pause, and the 2 more, and to her own breath settle into that count. She looked at the latch and turned it once to feel the movement again, and left it unthrown, because leaving it unthrown was her decision. She stood and checked the window one last time, and then set the shirt straight where it pulled across her shoulders. And she told herself out loud in a quiet tone that only the dog could hear, no more being moved without saying. The dog lifted his head and then slept again. When I came back, I knocked with 2 knuckles and waited even though the door was not barred, and then stepped in only when she said yes. The light had thinned toward late afternoon, and the square of brightness on the table had slid to the edge. I pulled the swing arm and set the pot off the heat, and the metal ticked and settled. We did not speak for a moment, because the day had already said enough, and because silence can be honest when it is not being used to hide. I finally said, "I will take first watch on nothing," which meant I would sleep light and rise at any odd noise. "I don't need a watch," she said, and then corrected herself because pride was useful only when it did not get in the way of safety. "I don't want you waiting in the hall," I said. "I'll sleep in my bed with my door open the way it always island. You sleep how you choose." And the room loosened another notch. She looked at the ledger again, and then at her wrapped wrists, and then at the dog, and then at me. The question that would matter tomorrow sat ready and did not need to be asked tonight. She said only, "In the morning, you will still mean what you said." And I answered, "Yes." And my voice had the weight of the thing I had carried longer than today. The listener's small questions that hook at the back of the mind had all found a place without stopping the story. Whether she had privacy, she had it. Whether I would expect more than food and shelter, I would not. Whether I had a plan if law or trouble came, I did. Whether the door truly turned from inside, it did. Whether the guns would be used to keep her in or others out. Whether there was room in the house for her decisions, there was, in a wooden latch and paper and spoken steps. When the light went low, I trimmed the lamp and set it on the table, and the room settled into the kind of quiet that does not press. She stood at the spare room door and looked once at the road through the window, and once at the bed, and then left the door wide and lay down with the bandaged hands loose on the quilt, and the coat folded where she could grab it if she changed her mind in the night. I checked the window hooks the way men with old worry do, and then blew the lamp, and the house made the small sounds it makes when 2 people breathe inside it for the first time. And nothing in that sound asked for more than morning. If you're watching on television, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel, so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. By the time they cleared the last building and the wagon ruts joined the open road, the noise of Cinder Creek had thinned to a scrape of wheels and a shout far off. The creek line showed ahead and the country opened the way it does once you pass the last boardwalk and the last of the questions anyone might still carry. Would the town try to undo what was done? Would a loud mouth turn into a hand with a weapon? Would the parson hedge? Would the clerk stall? Would the sheriff hold the doorway? Would Alara speak for herself in the room? All had been answered by steady steps and names written where they cannot be rubbed out. The rest of the day stood waiting on the far side of the second rise, where the wind ran clean, and the horses knew the way without being told. They left Cinder Creek without looking back, and the horses settled into a pace that could be held, and the road opened wide and clean. And by the second rise, the town noise had turned into one thin scrape behind them, and the creek line showed like a strip of glass, and they spoke little, because the work of the morning had taken most of their words, and what was left should be saved for when a thing truly needed saying. By the time the stone well came into view, Pike's bark reached them from the yard, and then dropped to a low huff as he caught their scent, and the house stood the same as they had left it, which is how a house ought to stand on a day when the law has been used for its proper purpose. I swung down first and loosened cinches and checked fetlocks with quick hands, and she stepped to the bucket rope and hauled water hand over hand and let each horse drink without rushing, and then led the spare mare to the rail while I ran a palm along the boards of the porch to feel for any draft I had missed. And there was none. Inside the kitchen, the air held last night's heat under the stove lid, and the square of light in the window had shifted to the far side of the table, and she set the shawl the parson's wife had given her on a peg beside the door, because a thing worn for a certain hour should have a place to rest when that hour is done. I lifted the front latch and then left it as it had been, so she could be the one to throw it later if she wanted, and she did not touch it yet, because leaving it unthrown was still her call. They ate standing at first because hunger had outpaced ceremony. Bread warmed on the stove board. The wrapped biscuit the parson's wife had pressed in her hand.